Elizabeth Carter pressed her palms flat against the kitchen table so nobody could see how badly her hands were shaking. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. Her stepmother stood at the window with her back turned, arms crossed tight like a woman who had already decided the argument was over before it began. The papers were right there on the table, signed, dated, sealed with the kind of finality that didn't leave room for questions. "You already agreed," Liz said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was somehow worse than if she had screamed. "You agreed without telling me." Her father finally looked up, and what broke her wasn't the guilt in his expression. It was the relief. He was relieved that it was done. "Elizabeth, we didn't have a choice. You had a choice." She pressed her palms harder against the wood. "You just didn't choose me." Before this story goes any further, if this is the kind of tale that speaks to your heart, a woman who was handed away like a debt, a man who loved her in secret for 7 years, and a love that neither of them ever expected, then please, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Elizabeth Carter and the morning that changed everything. The name on those papers was Ethan Walker. Liz had heard the name exactly once before in her life, spoken in passing at the general store in Milford Creek, Montana, by a woman who described him as the quiet man on the mountain who kept to himself and didn't much care for company. That was the full extent of what she knew about the man her parents had arranged for her to go live and work with in exchange for the cancellation of a debt that had been drowning the Carter family ranch for the better part of 3 years. Not a marriage exactly. Her father was careful to point that out as if the distinction made any of it more bearable. "It's honest work," he said, pushing the papers toward her like they were something reasonable. "Ethan Walker runs a large operation up on the northern ridge. He needs someone to manage the household accounts, keep the ledgers in order. You're good with numbers, Elizabeth. Better than anyone I know." "I'm your daughter," she said. "Not a solution to your bookkeeping problem. Liz, how long?" She looked down at the papers without touching them. "How long have you been planning this?" The silence that followed told her more than any answer could have. Her stepmother Margaret turned from the window then. She was a practical woman who had married Liz's father 4 years after Liz's mother passed, and she had never been unkind exactly, but she had never been warm either. She looked at Liz now with something that might have been pity if it hadn't also been so firmly resolved. 3 months, Margaret said. "We've been in conversation with Mr. Walker's representative for 3 months. 3 months. Liz had spent 3 months waking up before dawn to work the Carter land repairing fences in the cold, keeping the accounts as tight as she could manage, believing she was holding something together. And for 3 months, the people she was holding it together for had been arranging to send her away. "The Hendricks debt," she said slowly. "That's what this is about." Her father's jaw tightened. "Victor Hendricks has been patient." "Victor Hendricks is not a patient man," Liz said sharply. "I've seen the letters he sends. I keep the accounts. Remember, I know exactly how much we owe him, and I know exactly what kind of man he is. He's not patient. He's calculating." She finally lifted her eyes and looked at her father directly, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in years, because it hurt too much to see how tired he had become, how small. "What exactly did you promise him in exchange for him releasing this arrangement to Mr. Walker instead?" Neither of them answered, and that silence was the final piece clicking into place. "The East Pasture," Liz said. "You gave him the East Pasture. It was either the land or me." She said it flat and even. "It was either the land or me, and you needed the land to keep the ranch running so." Her father stood up. "Elizabeth, that is not what." "Don't." She held up one hand and was surprised by how steady it had become. The shaking was gone. What had replaced it was something colder and clearer, something that felt uncomfortably like the end of something she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to. "Don't explain it to me like I can't understand it. I've been understanding things I wasn't supposed to understand since I was 16 years old. I understand this just fine." She picked up the papers. She read through them in full while her father stood there, and her stepmother looked somewhere past her left shoulder. The arrangement was, as her father said, for honest work. She would manage the accounts and household ledgers at the Walker Ranch for a period of 1 year, at which point the terms would be reviewed. Her transportation would be arranged. She was to bring no more than she could carry in one travel case. One travel case. 22 years of her life. And she was being shipped off to a mountain she'd never visited, with a man she'd never met, and she was allowed one travel case. "When?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," Margaret said quietly. "Mr. Walker's man is coming with a wagon." Liz set the papers back down on the table. She smoothed them flat with her palm, taking care with the corners, the way she always took care with things, because that was who she was, and she refused to let this moment take that away from her. "All right," she said. "Elizabeth." "I said all right, Papa." She walked to the door of the kitchen. She stopped with her back to both of them. "I'll be packed by morning." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room she had slept in since she was a child with the quilt her mother had made folded across the foot of it, and she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying only helped if someone was there to notice, and the two people in this house had just proven more clearly than they ever had before that they saw her best when she was useful. She opened her travel case and started to decide what was worth taking. The wagon came on a gray Tuesday morning with a thin man named Dobbs driving it, who introduced himself with a single nod and didn't offer another word for the entire 4-hour journey up into the northern ridge country. Liz sat in the back on a wooden bench with her case on her lap and watched the Carter land disappear behind her, the familiar line of fence posts and the old split oak at the edge of the south field growing smaller until the bend in the road swallowed them entirely. She didn't look back after that. She had been careful not to let herself think too hard about Ethan Walker during the 2 days of packing and preparing and saying the kind of quiet, careful goodbyes that happen when everyone knows an apology is owed, but nobody quite has the courage to say it. She had focused instead on practical things. She had reviewed what she knew about ranch accounting. She had thought through what questions she might need to ask when she arrived. She had kept herself occupied with the mechanics of the situation so that the grief of it stayed somewhere she could manage it. But sitting in that wagon with nothing to do but think, she let herself ask the one question she hadn't allowed herself to consider yet. Why would a man like Ethan Walker agree to this arrangement? He wasn't owed the debt. The arrangement had clearly originated with Victor Hendricks, who held the Carter family's financial future in his fist. But somewhere in the renegotiating, Walker had entered the picture. His ranch was one of the largest private operations in the northern Ridge County. He was, according to every second-hand account Liz had been able to piece together, in 2 days of careful listening, a man of some means and considerable reputation. He did not need a bookkeeper badly enough to negotiate an arrangement like this, which meant he had chosen to, and that question why sat with her the rest of the way up the mountain. The Walker Ranch came into view around the last bend of a dirt road that climbed steadily through stands of pine and opened suddenly onto a wide, flat stretch of land that seemed to exist in its own world, separate from everything below. It was larger than she had expected. Not grand in the way that Victor Hendricks' properties were grand, all deliberate display and carefully maintained surfaces, but solid, real. The kind of place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. Dobbs pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and climbed down without comment. Liz stepped down herself before he could offer to help, which he showed no signs of doing anyway. She stood with her travel case and looked at the house and the yard and the mountains rising behind all of it, and she breathed in air that was colder and cleaner than anything she had known in the valley, and she felt for one confusing moment something she couldn't immediately name. Then the front door opened. Ethan Walker was taller than she expected, with broad shoulders and hands that belonged to a man who had worked outside his entire life. He wore a plain dark coat and a hat he didn't bother to remove until he was 3 steps off the porch, at which point he took it off and held it at his side in a gesture that struck Liz as oddly deliberate, as if he had thought about it in advance. He looked at her with dark, steady eyes that gave nothing away. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't rush anywhere. "I'm Ethan Walker. Welcome to the ranch." Liz lifted her chin slightly. "Mr. Walker." "How was the road?" "Fine." She studied him the way she had learned to study things that mattered carefully, without letting her expression show what she was looking for. "I'd like to understand the terms of this arrangement, if you don't mind. I read the papers my father signed, but I'd prefer to hear them from you directly." Something moved in his expression. She wasn't sure what. It came and went too quickly. "That's fair," he said. "Come inside. I'll have May put coffee on." "I don't need coffee," Liz said. "I need to understand what's expected of me and what I can expect in return. I'd rather do that standing here, if it's all the same to you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something she might under very different circumstances have called a smile crossed the corner of his mouth. Not amused exactly, more like recognition. "All right," he said. "Standing here it is." He put his hat back on. "What you can expect in return is fair pay for honest work. Your own room with a lock on the door that only you hold the key to 3 meals a day, prepared by May, who has been running this kitchen for 11 years and will likely run it for 11 more. What I expect from you is honest accounting, accurate ledgers, and that you tell me directly if something is wrong with how things are being managed. I don't want agreement for the sake of agreement. I want someone who can look at the numbers and tell me the truth." Liz waited. He waited back. "That's all," she said. "That's all. And if I decide after 30 days that I want to leave?" The question hung in the cold morning air. She watched him take it in, watched him consider it with the same unhurried steadiness that seemed to be the fundamental quality of how he operated. "Then you leave," he said simply. "I'll arrange transport back to Milford Creek. The debt arrangement is between your father and Hendricks. It's not a chain on your ankle." She stared at him. "I'm not entirely sure I believe that," she said honestly. "Given the way this arrangement was set up, I'd be within my rights to be skeptical." "You'd be within your rights," he agreed. "I'd probably be skeptical too in your position." "Then why should I take you at your word?" He considered her again with those quiet, steady eyes. "You shouldn't," he said. "Not yet. Watch what I do. That'll tell you more than anything I say." He stepped aside slightly, gesturing toward the house. "In the meantime, May made biscuits this morning, and they're better than anything you'll find between here and Billings. You don't have to have coffee, but it'd be a shame to miss the biscuits." Liz stood there for another moment. She picked up her travel case. "Fine," she said. "But I want to see the ledgers this afternoon. They'll be on the desk in the study by the time you've finished eating," he said. She walked past him toward the house. She was almost to the steps when she stopped and turned back slightly. "Mr. Walker," she said, "why did you agree to this arrangement?" He had already settled his hat back into place and was looking out over the yard with an expression she still couldn't read entirely. "Because it needed to be done," he said quietly. "And because I thought you deserved better than what you were about to get." Liz waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. She went inside. May turned out to be a short, broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with quick brown eyes and the kind of no-nonsense warmth that didn't waste itself on pleasantries, but made itself known in the way she set down a plate without being asked and refilled a cup before it was empty. She looked Liz over once when she came through the kitchen door, made some kind of internal assessment, and said, "Sit down, honey," in a tone that expected to be obeyed. Liz sat down. "The biscuits are good," she said after the first one. "I know they are," May said. "Don't let the butter go to waste." It was the closest thing to welcome Liz had felt since she walked out of her father's house 2 days ago, and she was startled to discover how much it mattered. The ledgers were on the desk by 2 o'clock exactly as Ethan had said. Liz spent the rest of the afternoon going through them, methodically making notes, flagging questions. The accounts were not in bad shape. They were actually considerably better organized than she had expected. But there were patterns in certain expense columns that struck her as worth examining more closely, and there was a supplier arrangement in the Southern records that didn't quite add up the way it should have. She noted everything, She said nothing yet. She wanted a full picture before she drew any conclusions. Ethan appeared at the study door at 5:30. He knocked, which she hadn't expected. "Anything?" he asked. "Several things worth discussing," she said. "Give me another day with these before we talk through them. I want to be sure I'm reading the patterns correctly before I tell you anything." He nodded, started to go. "Mr. Walker?" He stopped. "The supplier arrangement in the Southern accounts. The feed and grain ledger from the last quarter. Who negotiated those terms?" His expression shifted the smallest degree. "Man by the name of Greer. He was handling procurement before I let him go in March." "When in March?" "Third week." Liz looked back at the ledger. The discrepancies started in the second week of January. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He left without asking her what she'd found. She noticed that. He'd asked if there was anything but, when she said she needed another day, he respected it without pushing. She added that to the list of things she was tracking about Ethan Walker. She had been at the ranch for 6 days when she heard the rider coming up the South Road. She recognized the horse before she recognized the man. A big gray animal she had seen at Victor Hendricks's property in town on the 2 occasions she'd had reason to be anywhere near his operation. The man in the saddle was one of Hendricks's hands, a broad-faced man named Calhoun, who Liz had encountered exactly once before, in the Milford Creek General Store, when she had overheard him telling the store clerk that the Carter girl was about as much use as the Carter land, which wasn't saying much. She was at the fence line checking a repair that one of Ethan's hands had told her about that morning, working through the practical side of things alongside the accounting, because she had learned a long time ago that you couldn't manage numbers accurately if you didn't understand what they represented. She watched Calhoun ride past without acknowledging her and go straight to the main house. She finished what she was doing. Then she walked back to the house and let herself in through the kitchen. May was at the stove with her back turned, but she spoke without looking around. "He's in the front room with the boss." "I didn't ask," Liz said. "No," May agreed placidly. "But you walked in the back door instead of going around to the garden the way you've been doing, so I made an educated guess." Liz stopped in the kitchen doorway. From where she stood, she could hear the front room clearly enough. "Told you the arrangement was temporary." That was Calhoun's voice, flat and carrying the particular tone of a man who was relaying someone else's words and making them slightly worse in the translation. "Mr. Hendricks wants to discuss the terms." The terms were agreed upon. Ethan's voice was the same in a confrontation as it was in every other circumstance, level, unhurried, giving nothing away. "I don't have anything to discuss. Mr. Hendricks feels that Miss Carter's skills might be better utilized in a different capacity. Miss Carter is managing my accounts and doing it excellently." A pause. "Tell Victor that she's not available for a different capacity." "Mr. Walker, I'd encourage you to think carefully." "I've thought carefully," Ethan said. "My answer's the same." Liz stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The particular sensation of someone drawing a line and meaning it. She heard Calhoun leave. She heard the front door close. She stayed where she was. After a moment, Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway on the opposite side from where she stood. He looked at her without any particular surprise at finding her there. "You heard that," he said. "I heard it." He nodded once. "All right." He moved to pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot May kept on the stove. "You should know that Hendricks is going to push on this. He generally pushes on things until he gets what he wants." "I know," Liz said. "I've been watching him push on my family for 3 years." Ethan looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What do you know about how he operates beyond what affects your family?" She considered him. Then she walked to the table and sat down, and she told him what she knew. She told him about the patterns she'd noticed from the Carter accounts, the ways Hendricks structured debt so that it was nearly impossible to repay the supplier arrangements that locked people in the quiet land acquisitions that seemed unrelated until you mapped them against the debt histories of their former owners. She talked for nearly an hour. Ethan listened the whole time without interrupting, asking only the occasional question, and those questions were sharp and specific in ways that told her he had already been thinking about some of this himself. When she was done, he set down his empty cup. "There's more in those ledgers you found," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I think Greer was feeding information to Hendricks. I think some of the supplier discrepancies aren't accounting errors. I think they were intentional, and I think I can prove it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How long will it take you to build a full case?" he asked. 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe 3. He nodded. "Then take 3. Do it right." He stood up. "And Liz." It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, and something passed briefly across his expression before settling back into steadiness. "What you did just now, laying all of that out clear and direct, that took something." She looked at him. "It's just what I know." "That's what I mean," he said quietly. And he went back to the front room, leaving her alone in the kitchen with May, who was making no pretense whatsoever of not having heard every word. "More coffee?" May asked, not turning around. "Yes," Liz said. "Please." She pulled the ledger notes she'd brought in from the study and went back to work at the kitchen table, while the evening came down over the mountain, and for the first time in as long as she could reliably remember, she was not afraid of what the next day would bring. She was not rescued. She was not settled. She was not finished being angry about the way she had come to be here, or the people who had made that choice for her, or the weight of everything that still needed to be untangled. But she was working. She was thinking. She was being listened to. And somewhere in the tall pine country above Milford Creek, Montana, on a mountain that didn't belong to her. Yet Elizabeth Carter started very quietly to come back to herself. The 3 weeks Liz had promised herself stretched across the mountain like a slow burn, quiet on the surface and churning underneath. She worked the ledgers every morning from first light until May called her in for the noon meal, and then she went back to them in the afternoon until the light failed. She developed a system, 2 separate sets of notes, one for what the numbers showed on their face, one for what she believed they were hiding. The gap between those 2 columns was where Victor Hendricks lived, and the more she mapped it, the more clearly she could see the shape of him. Ethan left her to it. He came by the study door 2 or 3 times a day, knocked every single time, and asked either if she needed anything or if she had questions about a specific entry. He never asked how close she was or whether she had found enough yet. He never pushed, never hovered, never made her feel like the clock was running faster than she could work. That restraint cost him something. She could see it occasionally in the set of his jaw, or the way he came back from the south fence line later than he should have, moving like a man who had been doing physical labor as a substitute for something else. She filed that observation away without examining it too closely. On the 14th day, she found what she had been looking for. It was buried in a sub-ledger for a supplier called Grady & Sons that had been providing feed and grain to the Walker Ranch since the previous year. On paper, Grady & Sons was a legitimate operation out of Helena. Liz had initially treated it as an accounting irregularity. The pricing was inconsistent in ways that suggested either incompetence or favoritism in the negotiations. But when she cross-referenced the payment dates against the delivery records, she found something that made her sit very still for a long moment with her pen resting against the page. The deliveries didn't match, not close, not in a rounding error kind of way. The payment records showed full delivery on 12 separate occasions, when the delivery logs, which she had pulled from the ranch's physical records, the actual signed receipts from the hands who'd received goods, showed either partial delivery or no delivery at all. Someone had been paid for goods that were never fully provided, and the someone who had negotiated those supplier contracts was a man named Greer, who had left the Walker Ranch's employ in the 3rd week of March, which was, Liz now understood, not a coincidence. She went to find Ethan. He was at the corral with one of his hands, a young man named Holt, who couldn't have been more than 20, and who scrambled to look busy the moment Liz appeared. She didn't blame him. She had probably developed something of a reputation in the 2 weeks she'd been auditing everything that moved. "I need 10 minutes, she told Ethan. He handed Holt the lead rope he'd been holding and walked over to her without a word. She showed him the discrepancies right there at the corral fence, laying the relevant pages across the top rail because there wasn't time to go back to the study. She talked him through the comparison payment records against delivery receipts, the dates, the quantities, the dollar amounts she could confirm had been paid for goods that had never fully arrived. Ethan listened with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between her notes and her face with the kind of focused attention that told her he was tracking every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. "In total confirmed discrepancy, somewhere between $1,400 and $1,600 over 8 months, she said. "I can narrow it down further with another 2 days on the physical records, but those are the conservative figures." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And Greer was being paid for the difference somewhere," Liz said. "Not through your accounts, which means someone outside this ranch was supplementing his income." "Hendricks. That's my conclusion, yes," she said. "But I want to be careful about what I can prove versus what I suspect. What I can prove right now is the discrepancy and Greer's involvement. The line connecting Greer to Hendricks. I need more records for that. Do you have any correspondence from the period? Anything Greer sent or received through the ranch?" Ethan looked at her steadily. "There's a box of papers in the storage room off the barn. Things I boxed up when I cleared out his desk. I didn't go through them in detail because I was dealing with getting someone in to replace him. Can I have them? I'll get them to you this afternoon." She started to turn back toward the house. He said her name. "Liz." She stopped. "This is more than bad accounting, isn't it?" It wasn't quite a question. She turned back and met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I think Greer was placed here deliberately. I think someone needed eyes on this ranch's finances and didn't want to ask for them directly." She paused. "What does Hendricks want from you that he hasn't been able to get?" Ethan's expression shifted not a lot, but enough. "The water rights on the Northern Creek," he said. "He's been trying to buy them for 4 years. I've said no 4 times. Liz considered that. Water rights that would affect how many other properties in this county? 11 ranches that I know of depend on that creek system downstream." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then this isn't just about your ranch," she said. "And it probably isn't just about my family either." The box from the storage room arrived on her desk that afternoon, with Ethan carrying it himself rather than sending one of the hands. He set it down without ceremony and left her to it, which was exactly what she needed. She went through it methodically, paper by paper, setting aside anything that looked like personal correspondence or irrelevant material and focusing on anything that related to suppliers, pricing, outside parties, or scheduling. It took 4 hours. May brought her supper on a tray without being asked, and set it on the corner of the desk with a look that dared her to let it go cold. She found the letter at 8:30 in the evening. It was written on plain paper with no letterhead, and it was addressed to Greer in a handwriting that she didn't recognize, but the content made her hand tighten around the page, hard enough to crease it. The letter outlined in deliberately vague but unmistakable language a plan for gradually documenting and reporting irregularities in the Walker Ranch's accounts irregularities that Greer himself had introduced in a way that would call Ethan Walker's financial management into question with the Territorial Land Authority. The goal made clear in the last paragraph without ever being stated outright was to create the conditions under which a formal investigation might be opened, potentially resulting in a freeze on the ranch's operational licenses, which would include the water rights agreement. The letter wasn't signed with a full name. It was signed with a single initial. H. Liz sat with that letter for a solid minute before she moved. Then she stood up, left her supper untouched on the tray, and went to find Ethan. He was on the porch, which she had learned in 2 weeks was where he went when he needed to think. She had seen him out there twice before in the evenings, just standing with his coffee, or without it looking at the dark shape of the mountains, the way some men looked at a fire. He turned when he heard the door. She held up the letter. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he lowered it and looked out at the dark for a moment, and when he looked back at her, his expression had the particular quality of a man who had just had a suspicion confirmed that he had been hoping was wrong. "He was going to use his own planted irregularities to report me," Ethan said, "and then use the investigation to pressure the land authority on the water rights," Liz said. "It's clean. It's also the kind of thing that's very difficult to defend against once it's in motion, because you spend all your time responding to the false evidence instead of building your own case. Unless someone finds the letter before the plan goes into motion." "Unless someone finds the letter," she agreed. They stood in the cold night air, and the weight of what she had found settled between them. "He's going to know we found it," Ethan said. Calhoun reporting back about the visit combined with Greer leaving in March. Hendricks is smart enough to start wondering why the plan hasn't moved forward. "Which means he'll move to a different approach," Liz said. "And soon." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Walker, I need to take what I've found to someone with legal authority. The letter, the financial discrepancy records the delivery comparison. This is enough for a territorial complaint, possibly more." "Judge Alderman in Billings," Ethan said immediately. "He's not in Hendricks' pocket. He's one of maybe 3 people in this territory who aren't." "How quickly can we get word to him? I can have a man riding at first light." "Do it," she said. "And in the meantime—" She stopped. "In the meantime, what?" Ethan asked. She hesitated, which was unusual for her. She was aware of it. "In the meantime," she said carefully, "I need to know what else Hendricks has leverage over in this county. Because I don't think your water rights are the end of this. I think they're just the part of it that affects you. The families downstream, you said 11 ranches." "At least 11. Have any of them had similar problems? Accounting irregularities, personnel issues, suppliers who didn't perform?" He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that said she had just arrived somewhere he had been standing for a while. "The Dunn family," he said slowly, "lost 2 hands in the fall under circumstances that didn't quite make sense. The Brewsters had a supplier dispute that nearly cost them their spring planting contract." He paused. "The Hallorans. Tom Halloran mentioned at the feed store in January that he'd had paperwork trouble with the land authority. Something about a boundary dispute that came out of nowhere." Liz listened to each name with her jaw set. "These people know each other. Most of them. It's not a big county." "Would they talk to me?" Ethan went very still. "You want to go to them," he said. "I want to understand the full picture before we go to Judge Alderman," she said. "Because if I walk in there with a complaint about one ranch, Hendricks' lawyers will have it buried in 30 days. But if I walk in with a pattern documented cross-referenced covering multiple properties and multiple families, that's a different kind of case." He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she had pushed too far, asked for something beyond what the arrangement between them covered. Then he said, "I'll ride out with you tomorrow." She blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "These are my neighbors, and I know them better than you do. They'll talk more freely if I'm there." He looked at her steadily. "Unless you'd rather go alone." "No," she said after a moment. "No, having you there would help." He nodded, picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, looked at it with mild resignation. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll ride early." She was halfway back through the door when something stopped her. She didn't entirely understand why she said what she said next. It came out of a place she hadn't meant to open. "Why did you agree to take me on?" she asked. Not the way she'd asked it that first morning, which had been a tactical question, a way of establishing what she was dealing with. This was something different. She could hear the difference in her own voice, and she suspected he could too. The real reason. Not because it needed to be done. Ethan Walker stood on his porch in the cold Montana dark and looked at her for a long moment. "Get some sleep, Liz," he said quietly. Not unkind, not evasive exactly, but final in a way that told her the answer existed and that he had decided it wasn't time yet. She went inside. She lay on her bed in the room with the key that only she held, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the question she'd asked and the answer she hadn't gotten, and she filed it away in the part of herself that was still learning how to be patient with things she didn't yet understand. The Dunn family ranch was the first visit, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Margaret Dunn was a woman in her late 40s who met them at her gate with the particular wariness of someone who had learned to be careful about what she said and to whom. Ethan introduced Liz simply. "She's been going through my accounts and found some things you should hear about." And something in the straightforwardness of that seemed to unlock something in Margaret Dunn's expression. They sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. What Margaret Dunn told them was this. The 2 hands she had lost in the fall hadn't left of their own accord, despite what the official story was. They had been offered better paying work by a man they'd described to her as a representative of a Helena business interest, and they had been gone within a week. Shortly after their departure, she had received a formal notice from the land authority flagging a discrepancy in her property boundary records. A discrepancy she had never been aware of, that couldn't be traced to any survey she had authorized, and that had cost her 3 months and $200 to formally dispute. The boundary discrepancy had been resolved in her favor, but the process had forced her to use money she hadn't intended to spend, and it had delayed a fencing project that had then cost her part of her spring grazing capacity. "Did anyone from the Land Authority office contact you in person?" Liz asked. "Not a formal letter. In person." Margaret Dunn's eyes went careful. "A man came out in February," she said. "I didn't know him. He said he was there to discuss expediting the resolution if I was willing to discuss a land adjustment." "What kind of land adjustment?" "He wanted me to consider selling the Lower Creek access, the strip of land along the northern creek that gives me water rights." Liz felt the pattern click into place with a precision that was almost physical. "What did you tell him?" Ethan asked. "I told him no," Margaret said with the particular flatness of a woman who had been through enough that being pressured by men in suits had stopped frightening her and started making her angry. "I told him my water rights weren't for sale, and if he came back out here again without an invitation, I'd be having a conversation with the sheriff." "Did he come back?" Liz asked. "No," Margaret said. But the boundary notice came 3 weeks later. By the time they left the Dunn Ranch, the sun had moved well past its highest point, and the cold was settling in around the edges of the afternoon. Ethan rode beside Liz on the road toward the Brewster property, and neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "She's the 4th family to have a boundary notice." Liz looked at him sharply. "4th, that I know of," he said. "The Hallorans were first. The Brewsters had a different version, a surveying error, rather than a boundary dispute, but the outcome was the same. Delay caused distraction." He paused. "Someone's been manufacturing bureaucratic problems. Systematically," Liz said, "and targeting the families with the most significant water access. If you drew a map of the creek system and then mapped the families who've had land authority problems in the last 18 months, I'd bet you'd find near-perfect overlap." "I can draw that map," Ethan said. "I know this county." "Then when we get back tonight, draw it," she said, "because that map is going to be part of what I bring to Judge Alderman." At the Brewster property, they found Tom Brewster on his own. His wife was visiting her sister in town, and he was the kind of man who didn't particularly want to talk about his troubles, but who responded to directness with directness. When Liz laid out what she'd found in the Walker ledgers, and what Margaret Dunn had told them about the creek access approach, she watched something shift in Tom Brewster's face. Not surprise. Something more like the relief of a man who had suspected something and had been waiting for someone to confirm it. "The man who came to see me about the surveying error," Tom said slowly. "He didn't mention buying anything. He said if I was interested in simplifying the property lines, there were parties who might be interested in purchasing the creek frontage." He looked at Ethan. "I didn't take it seriously at the time. Figured it was just someone fishing." "It wasn't someone fishing," Liz said. "It was someone testing to see if you'd bite before they moved to the pressure approach." Tom Brewster was quiet for a moment. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that it needs to go to Billings," Ethan said. "We're going to the judge." Tom nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" A written account of the surveying visit and what was discussed, Liz said. Dates, names if you have them, any documentation the land authority sent you. I kept all the paperwork, Tom said. I generally keep everything that comes official just on principle. Good, Liz said. That's exactly right. They made 3 more visits before the light gave out completely. By the time they rode back up toward the Walker Ranch in the gathering dark, Liz had a portfolio of notes that was beginning to look less like an audit and more like a case file. 5 families, all with documented land authority interference, all approached about their water access, all within the last 18 months. The approaches had varied different men, different pretexts, different levels of pressure, but the underlying pattern was as clear and deliberate as anything she had seen in the Walker ledgers. Victor Hendricks had been conducting a systematic campaign to acquire or compromise every significant water right along the Northern Creek system. The families who had refused to sell had found themselves buried in manufactured bureaucratic problems. The families who had been weakened enough by the process were probably the next targets for acquisition pressure. And Ethan Walker, with the most significant water rights of all, had been the subject of the most sophisticated approach of the lot, a planted agent inside his own operation. He's been planning this for a long time, Liz said as they rode. This isn't opportunistic. This was designed. Years, Ethan agreed. I think this started before my father died. She looked at him. Your father owned this ranch before you. He did. He turned down the first offer on the creek rights in 1878. Hendricks has been circling ever since. His voice was even, but she heard something underneath it that was old and quiet and not entirely settled. My father never knew how organized it was. He just thought Hendricks was persistent. Did he ever? She stopped herself. Did he ever what? Did he ever have trouble with suppliers, with the accounts? Ethan rode in silence for a moment. There was a period, he said slowly, about 2 years before he died when things were harder than they should have been. He said he couldn't figure out where the money was going. He died thinking it was bad management. The weight of that settled over both of them like the dark. It wasn't? Liz said. No, Ethan said. I don't think it was. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, and the mountain closed around them in the dark, and Liz thought about a man who had spent his last years blaming himself for something that had been done to him deliberately, and she felt the familiar shape of a particular kind of anger that she recognized because she had been living with her own version of it for years. The kind of anger that comes from watching people with power use it to quietly destroy people who have no idea they're being targeted. May had kept supper warm. They ate at the kitchen table because the dining room felt too formal for what they were carrying, and Ethan drew the map while Liz organized her notes, and May moved around them without comment, refilling cups, and setting down bread, and managing somehow to make the whole serious weighted evening feel like something that could be survived. The map, when it was finished, was worse than Liz had expected. Every family they had visited sat along the creek system at roughly even intervals. The ones who had been approached earliest about selling were the ones with the most serious ongoing land authority problems. The Walker Ranch sat at the top of the system controlling the primary water source. If Hendricks had succeeded with the Walker accounts, with the boundary disputes, with the access road surveys, he apparently had in motion for 2 more families they hadn't visited yet. He would have controlled the water for nearly all of the viable ranch land in the northern Ridge County. This is monopolization, Liz said quietly. This isn't just fraud. This is systematic economic control of an entire region. Is that a crime? Ethan asked. It's several crimes, she said. Some of them federal, potentially. She looked at the map. Mr. Walker, I think we need more than Judge Alderman. He studied her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that the patterns in these documents, the false accounting, the manufactured boundary, disputes the targeted approach to families with water rights. This has the shape of something a territorial attorney general's office would be very interested in. Especially if any of it crosses state lines, which I suspect it does, if Greer and the Helena supplier connection are as intertwined as I think they are. That's a much larger fight than a county complaint, Ethan said. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at the map. He looked at her. Outside, the wind had come up against the side of the house, the kind of wind that came down off the high peaks and meant business. All right, he said. Let's make it a larger fight. Liz looked at him across the kitchen table, with the map between them and May quietly washing the last of the supper dishes, and she felt something shift inside her that she didn't have clean language for yet. It was not rescue. It was not dependency. It was something she had very little experience with, and was therefore moving toward slowly and with great care. It was the feeling of not being alone in a fight that mattered. She looked back at the map. I need to write everything up formally, she said. Clear, documented, organized, so that it can stand up to legal scrutiny. She paused. And I need to go back to town. Ethan went still. Milford Creek, he said. I need to look at the land authority records directly, she said. The public filing records. If the boundary disputes were filed officially, they'll be in the county record books, and I can cross-reference the filing dates against the approaches the families described. She paused. I also need to see if there are additional filings that target ranches we haven't visited yet. Hendricks has people in town, Ethan said. If you go down there and start pulling public records, he'll know within the day. Then we'll need to move faster than he can respond, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll go with you. You just said Hendricks has people in town. He does, Ethan said. Which is exactly why you're not going alone. She started to object on principle, and then stopped because it wasn't principle really. It was reflex. The same reflex she'd been operating on for years, the conviction that needing backup was the same thing as weakness, that accepting help was the same as admitting you couldn't manage on your own. She recognized the reflex for what it was, and she set it aside. All right, she said. Tomorrow. Ethan nodded. He stood up, gathered the map carefully, and handed it to her to add to the case file. Liz, he said. She looked up. What you've built here in 3 weeks. He stopped, and she saw him choose his words with the same deliberate care he applied to most things. What you found is going to matter to a lot of people who've been waiting for someone to see what was happening to them. She held the map and looked at him, and didn't say anything for a moment. They've been seeing it themselves all along, she said finally. They just didn't have anyone to put it together. That's what I mean, he said quietly. He said goodnight. He went to his room. May finished the dishes and dried her hands and looked at Liz with those quick brown eyes. You know, May said conversationally, in 11 years I have never seen that man stay in the kitchen past 8 o'clock for anyone. May, Liz said, I'm just noting it. May said serenely and turned off the kitchen lamp on her way to bed. Liz sat alone at the table in the dark for a minute with the map in her hands and the full weight of what was coming pressing against the walls of the room. Then she lit the lamp back up and went back to work. Because there were families downstream who didn't know yet that someone was finally putting their story on paper, and she intended to have it ready before Victor Hendricks had any idea what was about to hit him. They rode down to Milford Creek before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and Liz spent the first mile of that ride going over her notes in her head, the way she had been going over them all night, because she had slept maybe 3 hours, and her mind had refused to stop working through the rest of it. Ethan rode beside her without demanding conversation, which she had come to understand was one of his fundamental qualities, the ability to be present without requiring anything from that presence. She had known very few people like that in her life. Her father talked when he was nervous, which meant he talked constantly whenever something important was happening, and never said the thing that actually needed saying. Margaret had a version of the same habit, filling silence with practicality, the way other people filled it with sentiment. Ethan just rode. She was grateful for it this morning more than most. The county record office in Milford Creek opened at 8 o'clock and was run by a man named Gerald Pratt, who was somewhere in his 60s, and had the particular disposition of someone who loved order above all things and found most people's relationship with paperwork personally offensive. He looked at Liz over the top of his glasses when she came in and asked for the land authority filing records from the past 24 months, and his expression said clearly that he found the request suspicious on principle. Then Ethan came through the door behind her. Something shifted in Gerald Pratt's face. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of someone whose reputation preceded him in ways that made obstruction inadvisable. "Mr. Walker," Pratt said. "Morning, Gerald." Ethan said the same level tone he used for everything. The record books appeared on the counter within 4 minutes. Liz worked quickly and methodically, running her finger down the filing columns and pulling every boundary dispute, surveying notation, and land authority flag from the past 2 years. She wrote down every case number, every filing date, every respondent name. Gerald Pratt hovered at the edge of her peripheral vision with the expression of a man watching someone handle his belongings without adequate care, but he didn't interfere. Ethan stood at the counter and said nothing, and managed somehow, purely through stillness, to communicate that interference would be unwelcome. By the time she had worked through both record books, she had 17 cases. 17 families with formal land authority actions in 24 months in a county where the typical average was 3 or 4 per year. 12 of those 17 sat along the Northern Creek system. Of the remaining 3 were on tributary streams that fed into the Northern Creek upstream of the main ranching corridor. It was not a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. But seeing it laid out across 17 lines of her own handwriting made it real in a way that the theory had not fully been. She closed her notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Pratt," she said. He nodded with the dignity of a man who had not been thanked nearly enough in his professional life. She wondered briefly, walking out, whether Gerald Pratt himself had noticed the pattern in his own records, whether he had looked at the volume of filings and found it strange, whether he had said anything to anyone. She filed that question away. There might be a time for it. Outside, Ethan fell into step beside her without asking what she'd found. He waited. 17 cases, she said. 12 on the creek corridor, 3 on tributaries upstream. His jaw did the thing it did when the number was worse than he expected. 17. "In 24 months, she said. "I need to cross-reference these against the families you know to see how many we haven't spoken with yet." She paused. "And I need to do it before we're seen standing on this street much longer." He glanced up briefly. "Calhoun's at the feed store," he said with the quiet certainty of someone who had developed very good peripheral vision from long practice. "Came in while you were inside." "Does he know we're here?" "He knows my horse." She kept walking at the same pace, not looking toward the feed store. "How long do you think we have before he gets word to Hendricks?" "He'll have left already if he's smart," Ethan said. "Hendricks pays him to be smart." "Then we need to move faster than I planned." She thought through the timeline. The written case file she needed to prepare for Judge Alderman. The formal documentation of the discrepancies, the letter, the delivery records, the cross-referenced filing history. She had most of it organized, but she needed another day at minimum to write it up in a form that would hold up under legal scrutiny. "If Hendricks moves before I finish the documentation, he'll move on the ranch," Ethan said quietly. "Not on us directly. He's been too careful for direct moves. He'll try to accelerate whatever plan he has in play." "The account scheme is already compromised," Liz said. "He knows Greer is gone and the arrangement didn't produce what he expected. He'll shift to something else." She ran through the logic quickly. The boundary disputes are a slow game. If he wants to move fast, he needs a faster lever. She stopped walking. "What does he hold over your operation that isn't in the financial records?" Ethan looked at her. "The grazing permit," he said slowly. "The permit for the Eastern High Meadow comes up for renewal in 6 weeks. It goes through the Territorial Land Office in Helena." "And does he have connections in that office?" "I've been assuming he does for 3 years," Ethan said, without being able to prove it. "Then that's where he'll push," she said. "If he can get that permit delayed or denied, it compromises your summer grazing capacity and puts pressure on your operating finances without touching the water rights directly." She started moving again. "We need to get everything to Billings before he can file anything in Helena. Which means I need to finish the documentation tonight." "Then let's go," he said. They were back at the horses when a voice behind them said, "Miss Carter." They both turned. The man standing 20 feet away on the boardwalk was not Calhoun. He was younger, better dressed with the particular polish of someone who worked in offices, rather than outdoors, and wanted people to know it. He had a leather satchel under his arm, and he was looking at Liz with the expression of someone who had been sent to deliver an uncomfortable message and had decided the fastest way through it was the direct way. "My name is Peters," he said. "I represent the interests of Mr. Victor Hendricks. I wonder if I might have a word." "You can have several," Liz said. "You've got 30 seconds. Peters blinked. She guessed expected her to be easier than this. Something about the way people had always underestimated her because she was young, and because she was a woman, and because she had come here as someone's debt. She felt that assumption coming off him in a wave, and she was very tired of it. "Mr. Hendricks is aware that you've been reviewing certain financial records on behalf of Mr. Walker," Peters said, recovering quickly. He was a professional, she gave him that. "He's prepared to consider those findings resolved without any need for outside involvement if Miss Carter would be willing to discuss a more straightforward arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Ethan said. His voice had gone to a particular register she hadn't heard from him before, not loud, quieter actually than usual. Peters addressed Liz directly, which told her Hendricks had correctly assessed that she was the center of gravity here. "Mr. Hendricks would be prepared to forgive the Carter family debt in full," he said, "and to ensure that Miss Carter's return to her family's ranch is managed comfortably in exchange for her cooperation in stepping back from any formal documentation or filing she may be considering." The street was not particularly busy, but there were people on it. 2 women coming out of the dry goods store had slowed down. A man loading his wagon at the far end of the block was looking over his shoulder. Liz was aware of all of them. "He wants me to go home," she said. "He wants the documents to disappear and me to go home and he'll call it even." "That's a generous characterization of—" "No," she said. Peters paused. "Miss Carter." "I said no," she said, clearer, not louder. "Tell Mr. Hendricks that the answer is no. Tell him that if he'd like to discuss the matter further, he can do it in front of Judge Alderman in Billings, where I intend to be within the week." She held Peter's gaze steadily. "And tell him that attempting to approach me again outside of a legal setting will be documented and added to what I bring to that meeting." Peters looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan, possibly hoping for something different there. Ethan looked back at him with the specific quality of a mountain that had heard a question and found it uninteresting. Peters left. Ethan waited until he was out of earshot. "He went straight to you," he said. "He told Hendricks it was you." "Calhoun saw me with the records," she said. "Pratt probably talked." She mounted her horse. "It doesn't change anything. It just means the clock is shorter than we thought." "How short?" "If Hendricks is moving today, we have maybe 4 days before he can mobilize something in Helena on the grazing permit." She looked at Ethan. "I need 2 days to finish the documentation. Can you get a message to Alderman today? Not a rider. Faster." "Telegraph office is 2 blocks back," he said. "Then let's go." She finished the full documentation in 31 hours. She did not sleep during those 31 hours, except for a single 2-hour stretch that May essentially forced on her by the expedient of removing her lamp oil at 1 in the morning and refusing to return it until Liz had lain down. Ethan's telegraph to Judge Alderman's office in Billings produced a reply by the following afternoon. The judge would see them in 4 days at the courthouse, and he requested that they bring all original documentation rather than copies. 4 days was tight but manageable. Barely. She was at the kitchen table at noon on the second day doing the final organization of the case file when Holt came to the back door with an expression that aged him about 10 years in the time it took him to get it out. "Miss Carter," he said, "there's a man at the south gate with a letter. He says it's for you personally, and he won't leave it with anyone else." She looked up from the documents. "Who sent him?" Holt hesitated. "He said it's from your father." She was still for a moment. Then she set her pen down and went to the south gate. The man waiting there was not anyone she recognized, just a ranch hand hired to carry a message, looking uncomfortable about the whole business. He handed her the letter and left before she had finished opening it. Her father's handwriting. She would have known it in the dark. The letter was short. He had heard he wrote that she had been in Milford Creek pulling records. He had heard through channels he didn't specify that she was planning to go to Billings. He needed her to understand that Victor Hendricks had called in the Carter debt in full, all of it, effective immediately, and that if she continued on the path she was on, the ranch would be seized within the month. He was not asking her to stop, he wrote, though she could read clearly enough between those words that he was. He was just making sure she knew what was at stake. She folded the letter. She stood at the south gate in the cold, with the folded letter in her hand, and she felt the full familiar weight of it. The guilt, the responsibility, the particular exhaustion of loving people who used that love as a mechanism to slow you down. Then she went back inside. Ethan was in the study. He looked up when she came in, read something in her face and waited. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but she saw something move through it, a particular kind of anger that was very controlled and therefore very serious. "He called in the Carter debt," Ethan said. "Yes." "As leverage against you." "Yes." He set the letter down. "Liz, I'm not stopping," she said. "I want you to understand that before you say anything. I'm not stopping because of this letter. What Hendricks is doing to my family now is the same thing he's been doing to every family on that creek system. The mechanism is the same. The only difference is that it's personal." She looked at Ethan steadily. "I'm not going to let personal make me smaller." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you're not," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She blinked. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say that I can cover the Carter debt," he said quietly, and without drama, the way he said most things. "Not as charity. As a formal loan arrangement documented and legal with repayment terms your father agrees to. It removes Hendricks' immediate leverage without giving him anything." Liz stared at him. "You—" She stopped, started again. "You would do that?" "I'm offering to do it," he said. "There's a difference." She stood with the full weight of that offer sitting on her chest, and she tried to find the place in herself where the reflex lived, the one that would tell her to say no, that this was too much, that she didn't take things from people, and she found that the reflex was there, but it was quieter than it had been 3 weeks ago. She had been watching Ethan Walker for 3 weeks. She had been watching what he did the way he had told her to do that first morning, because he had said it would tell her more than his words. And what he did consistently and without asking for recognition was exactly what he said. "All right," she said. Something shifted in his expression, the smallest degree. "All right," he said. "But I'm paying it back," she said. "Every dollar. Terms in writing. I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She sat back down at the table. She picked up her pen. Her hand was steady. "Then let's finish this," she said. They were 2 days from their scheduled appointment with Judge Alderman when the trouble came up from the South Road in the form of 4 riders, and it came at 11 o'clock at night, and the first sign of it was the smell of smoke. Holt was the one who woke the house, pounding on doors in the dark, with a voice that was trying very hard not to sound as frightened as it was. Liz was dressed and in the yard within 2 minutes. Ethan was already there. The south barn was on fire. Not the main structure they would have seen, that from the house before they smelled it. The smaller outbuilding at the southeast corner of the yard where the winter feedstock was stored. It was well alight by the time Liz got there, and the hands were already moving, bucket lines, horses being pulled away from the adjacent corral. Holt shouting directions with considerably more composure than Liz would have expected from someone who had been afraid 3 minutes ago. Ethan was at the well with his coat off before she reached him. "The feedstock," she said. "We can replace feedstock," he said, pulling a bucket up. "The horses can't be replaced." He looked at her over his shoulder. "Get inside." "I'm not getting inside." He opened his mouth, closed it again, handed her a second bucket. She worked the bucket line with the rest of them for 2 hours until the outbuilding was down to char and smolder, and the adjacent structures were confirmed safe. Her arms ached and her eyes were streaming from the smoke, and she suspected a complete disaster from the outside, and none of that mattered at all compared to the cold clarity that had settled over her about what the fire meant. When it was over, Ethan gathered the hands together in the yard. 6 men, including Holt, all of them exhausted and smoke-smudged. "Anybody see the riders?" he asked. A man named Casper, who'd been on the south fence that evening, said quietly, "4 of them. They came up the south road around 10:30. I didn't think much of it. We get riders on that road sometimes. By the time I saw them cut toward the buildings, I was too far back to do anything." "You recognize any of them?" Casper shook his head. "Dark. Too far." Ethan nodded once. "All right. You did right. Get some sleep, those who can. I want double shifts on the perimeter for the next 3 nights starting tonight." He looked at Holt. "You're on east tonight." "Yes, sir," Holt said. The hands dispersed. Ethan turned to find Liz standing exactly where she'd been. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. "Are you going to—" He looked at the smoking ruin of the outbuilding. "Probably not. Then neither am I." She crossed her arms against the cold. "He escalated." "Yes?" "He escalated because he knows we're going to Billings, and he's trying to frighten us into stopping." "Yes," Ethan said. "This is actually good news," she said. He turned to look at her with an expression that was for Ethan Walker remarkably close to open surprise. "Hear me out," she said. "He's been careful for years. Systematic, slow, deniable. He plants accounting irregularities. He manufactures bureaucratic problems. He sends men in suits to talk about property line adjustments. Everything he does is designed to be difficult to trace directly back to him." She held his gaze. 4 men setting fire to your outbuilding at 11 o'clock at night is not any of those things. That is a frightened man making a mistake. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And frightened men make more mistakes." "If we give them the right pressure," she said. "We need to add this to the file, tonight, with the date and time and Casper's account of the 4 riders. I want it in front of Judge Alderman as part of the same presentation, not as a separate incident, as the continuation of a pattern that just broke its own discipline." He looked at her for a long moment, in the smoke-smelling dark. There was something in his expression that she was learning to read, something that existed behind the steadiness that she hadn't had the right context for in the first weeks and was beginning to understand now. "Liz," he said. "Don't tell me to be careful," she said. "I wasn't going to tell you to be careful," he said. "I was going to ask you when you last slept more than 2 hours." She looked at him. "That's not relevant." "It's relevant to me," he said quietly. She heard what was underneath that. Not as clearly as she would hear it later, not with the full understanding that would come after Billings and after all the things that were still waiting for them up the road. But she heard something. She looked away first. "Get some coffee on," she said. "I'll start writing up Casper's account. You can check it when it's done." She heard him move toward the house behind her. She stood in the yard for one more moment, looking at the black smear where the outbuilding had been feeling the cold and the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, something that was not quite fear and not quite calm. She was close. She knew she was close. The evidence was nearly complete. The appointment was in 2 days, and Victor Hendricks had just proven by setting a fire, instead of sending a lawyer, that he knew it too. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table across from a pot of coffee that May had started impossibly in the time it had taken everyone else to not sleep, and she opened her notebook to a fresh page, and she wrote the date and the time and began with the words, "At approximately 22:30 hours, on the evening of the 14th. 4 unidentified riders approached the Walker Ranch from the South Road." She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she pushed the notebook across the table. Ethan read it without comment. Then he read it again. "It's accurate," he said. "Of course it's accurate," she said. He almost smiled. She was becoming better at noticing the almost. "There's something else," he said. He had been turning a thought over since the fire. She could tell by the particular quality of the silence he'd been carrying. Casper saw 4 riders. I know this county, and I know Hendrix's operation. He doesn't use local men for something like this. Too much risk of being identified. He'd bring men from outside, and he'd bring them through a specific route. She looked up. The South Road. The South Road comes from the Hendrix property line, he said. 22 miles. Long way to come and go in one night without being seen by anyone. He paused. Unless you knew someone along the route who'd keep quiet. Or unless you had a reason to use that route regularly and had already established that it was clear, she said. Meaning this might not have been the first time riders came up that road. They looked at each other. Casper's been on the south fence for 6 months, Ethan said slowly. I'm going to have a longer conversation with him in the morning. Before Billings, she said. Before Billings. He agreed. The coffee was getting cold. Neither of them moved to refresh it. Outside, somewhere on the east perimeter, Holt was doing his rounds in the dark, and the mountain sat heavy and silent over all of them. And Liz thought about her father's letter folded in her coat pocket, and Victor Hendrix' 4 riders, and the 17 names in her notebook, and everything that was riding on 2 days and a judge in Billings, who was, according to Ethan, one of maybe 3 people in the territory who could be trusted. Tell me about Judge Alderman, she said. Ethan settled back slightly in his chair. 63 years old. Came up from Texas in 1861. He's been on the territorial bench since before Montana had a state government. He's seen most of what there is to see. Is he good? He's fair, Ethan said, which she was learning was Ethan's highest category. He doesn't like theatrics, and he doesn't like wasted time. He'll want facts, and he'll want them in order. He paused. He'll also want to know why it's taken this long to bring it to him. Because until 3 weeks ago, nobody had put it together, she said. That's what you'll tell him. That's what's true, she said. Ethan looked at her across the kitchen table, the case file between them, coffee going cold, smoke smell still in both their hair. Liz, he said, 7 years ago. He stopped. She went very still. The sentence had come from somewhere different than everything else he said. She could hear it. He'd started it and then pulled back from it, and she didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt the weight of it like a change in air pressure. 7 years ago, she said carefully. What? He looked at her for a long moment. His expression had the particular quality of a decision being made and then not quite made. Nothing, he said. Get some rest if you can. We ride early. He stood up and took his cold coffee to the sink, and she sat at the table and watched him go, and felt the sentence hanging in the kitchen like smoke from a fire that wasn't finished yet. 7 years ago. She turned it over on the way to her room, lay down on her bed without changing out of her smoke-smelling clothes because she was too tired to manage more than taking off her boots. Stared at the ceiling. 7 years ago she had been 15 years old and living in the valley, and the Walker name had meant nothing to her. 7 years ago Ethan Walker had been 2021 living on this mountain with his father, who had turned down Hendrix's first offer on the creek rights in 1878, and who had died not knowing that the financial trouble of his last years had been manufactured. 7 years ago. She fell asleep before she could finish the thought. She dreamed of a road she didn't recognize, and a girl in a brown coat, and the specific quality of being seen from a distance by someone who didn't announce themselves. She woke up 2 hours later knowing exactly what she needed to say to Judge Alderman, and she lay there in the dark with it organized in her mind, like the cleanest set of accounts she had ever put together, every column balanced, every figure verified. She was ready. She thought about Ethan's unfinished sentence and the question it raised that she wasn't ready for yet. One thing at a time, she told herself. Billings first, everything else after. She closed her eyes and waited for morning, and the mountain waited with her. And somewhere in the dark, Victor Hendrix was almost certainly making plans, and she found to her own surprise that she was not afraid of any of it. She was prepared, and prepared she had learned was the best kind of fearless. They reached Billings on a Wednesday morning after a day and a half of hard riding, and Liz spent most of that ride going over the case file in her head, the way she had been going over everything for the past 3 weeks methodically, in order testing each piece against the questions a skeptical judge would ask. She had 17 land authority filings. She had the Grady and Sons discrepancy documents. She had the letter signed with a single H. She had signed statements from Margaret Dunn Tom Brewster the Hallorans and 2 other families they had visited in the last push before leaving. She had Casper's written account of the 4 riders on the night of the fire with the date, the time, and his description of direction and approach. And she had the map, Ethan's map drawn by a man who knew every inch of his county, showing the creek system and the 17 affected properties laid out in a pattern that was impossible to misread once you saw it. She had spent the last hour before they left the ranch, reading the whole file through one more time looking for gaps. She had found 2 things she couldn't yet prove: the direct connection between Greer and Hendrick's money, and the involvement of specific individuals in the Helena land office. She had documented those as known unknowns. She intended to present them as the next investigative steps, rather than trying to paper over them, because Judge Alderman, according to Ethan, did not like gaps that had been dressed up to look like conclusions. Ethan had been right about most things so far. She intended to trust him on this one too. Billings was larger than Milford Creek, in the way that a real town was larger than a crossroads, not just in size, but in the particular quality of its noise and motion, the sense of multiple things happening simultaneously, and none of them waiting for anyone. Liz had been here twice before in her life, both times with her father on supply runs, and she had spent both visits focused on practical business and not paying much attention to the city itself. She paid attention now. She was about to walk into a courthouse with a case that affected at least 17 families, and she wanted to be clear-eyed about the territory she was operating in. Judge Alderman's clerk was a young man who took their names with the efficiency of someone who did not believe in unnecessary words and directed them to a waiting room outside the judge's chambers. Liz sat with the case file on her lap and her back straight and went over the opening summary in her head one more time. Ethan sat beside her and watched the door. After 22 minutes, she counted the clerk reappeared. "Judge Alderman will see you now." Cornelius Alderman was 63 years old, with the face of a man who had heard a great many stories and had long since developed the ability to tell the difference between the ones that were true and the ones that merely wanted to be. He had gray eyes that moved between Liz and Ethan and the case file she set on his desk with the precise, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the quality of his attention was itself a form of authority. He did not ask them to sit down immediately. He opened the case file first. He read the opening summary in silence. Then he looked up at Liz. "You prepared this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," she said. "You're not a lawyer." "No, sir. I manage the accounts for the Walker Ranch. The irregularities in those accounts were my entry point into the broader pattern." Alderman looked back at the file. He turned to the map. He studied it for a long moment, then turned to the land authority filing records she had cross-referenced against it. "Sit down," he said without looking up. They sat. He read for another 4 minutes in complete silence. Liz did not fidget. She had learned at a young age that people who fidgeted in silence gave away more than they intended to, and she had spent years training herself out of the habit. "The letter," Alderman said. "The one signed with an H chain of custody. Found in a document box sealed at the time of the employee's departure," Liz said. "The box was held in a locked storage room on the Walker property, and not opened until I requested it as part of the account audit. I can provide the date I examined it and the circumstances of the find. The employee, Greer, Nathan Greer, employed by the Walker Ranch from March 1879 through March 1882. Let go for performance issues officially. In practice, based on what you've laid out here, he was let go before the accounting scheme was fully operational," Alderman said, "which means whoever placed him there considered the operation compromised at that point." "That's my reading of the timeline, yes, sir." Alderman turned to Ethan. "Mr. Walker, these water rights, What's the current assessed value? Ethan answered directly with the figures. Alderman listened, then made a note. The families who gave written statements, Alderman said. They understand this may become a formal investigation involving their testimony. They do, Ethan said. They came forward willingly. Most of them have been waiting for someone to tell them what they were dealing with. Alderman set down the file. He folded his hands on top of it. I'm going to be straightforward with you both, he said. What you've brought me is well documented and it is serious. The Land Authority filing pattern alone, if it holds up to independent verification, represents a level of organized interference I have not seen in this territory before. He paused. Victor Hendricks is also a man with considerable resources and considerable connections, including at least 2 individuals in the Helena Territorial Administration whose relationship with his interests I have had my own questions about for some time. Liz felt the air in the room change. You've been watching him, she said. Alderman looked at her steadily. I've been aware of him, he said carefully. Awareness and evidence are different things. You've come in today with evidence. Then what happens next? Ethan asked. I'm going to refer this to the Territorial Attorney General's office, Alderman said. I'm also going to issue a temporary hold on any further Land Authority actions affecting the properties listed in your filing effective immediately pending investigation. That stops the bleeding while the larger question is addressed. He looked at the fire incident report. The arson, that's a separate criminal matter. I'm referring that to the county sheriff's office in your county and a parallel inquiry out of this office. 4 riders is not nothing. I want that thread pulled. The riders came from the South Road, Liz said, which runs from the Hendricks property line. Ethan's hand, Casper, has been on the south fence for 6 months. He reported unusual rider activity on 2 prior occasions that he didn't connect to anything specific at the time. Those dates are in the report. Alderman's eyes moved to the report and back to her. You documented prior incidents. I documented what Casper told me when we spoke to him the morning after the fire, she said. He hadn't reported the earlier sightings because he had no reason to consider them significant. He does now. Alderman was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man recalibrating an assessment. Miss Carter, he said, how long did it take you to build this case? 3 weeks, she said. He looked at the file, then back at her. 3 weeks. I had access to the original documents and the knowledge of the county that Mr. Walker provided, she said. The structure was there. It just needed to be mapped. It needed someone who knew how to read it, Alderman said. He closed the file. I'm going to need the original documents to remain with this office as of today. Can you leave them? I made copies, she said. Verified against the originals and notarized at the Billings notary office this morning before we came here. The originals are yours. Ethan glanced at her. She had not told him about the notary stop. She had made it in the 20 minutes she'd asked for between arriving in Billings and coming to the courthouse, telling him only that she had an errand. Alderman almost smiled. It was the most expression she had seen from him. Notarized this morning. I wasn't going to walk in here with documents I couldn't verify the integrity of, she said simply. No, Alderman said. I don't suppose you were. He stood, which signaled the end of the meeting. Liz and Ethan rose. You'll hear from my office within 5 days, Alderman said. In the meantime, and I want to be clear about this, you should proceed with normal operations and avoid direct confrontation with Hendricks or anyone in his employ. If he moves on the grazing permit in Helena, let him file it. A filing made while an investigation is pending looks considerably worse than one made before. Let him make his own mistakes. He already started making them, Ethan said. Then let him continue, Alderman said. He looked at Liz one more time. You did good work here, Miss Carter. Clean, documented, logically presented. The territory could use more people who know how to do this. She thanked him, without elaborating, and followed Ethan out of the chambers and through the courthouse hall and out into the Billings Street. And she stood on the boardwalk with the wind coming up from the south and the weight of 3 weeks and 31 hours and 1 2-hour sleep lifting from her shoulders in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Her eyes burned. She pressed the back of her hand against them quickly. "Hey," Ethan said quietly beside her. "I'm fine," she said. "It's the wind." He didn't say anything to that. He just stood there, which was what he did, and let her have the moment she needed. After a minute, she pulled herself straight and looked at him. He said 5 days. He did. That's 5 days in which Hendricks doesn't know what just happened in there. No, Ethan agreed. He doesn't. He's still going to move on the grazing permit. He doesn't know to stop yet. Probably. Good, she said with a satisfaction that surprised even her. Let him file it, like Alderman said. Ethan looked at her with an expression she had learned to interpret as close to admiration as he got. You want to eat something? It's past noon. She realized abruptly that she was extraordinarily hungry. Yes, she said. Somewhere that isn't the road. He took her to a place 2 streets off the main road that was by any measurable standard. Nothing impressive. Plain tables, plain food. The kind of place that existed to feed working people who had things to do afterward. But the coffee was hot and real, and the food arrived quickly, and Liz ate with the appetite of someone who had been running on concentration and willpower for 3 weeks and had finally been given permission to stop. They didn't talk much while they ate. They didn't need to. The courthouse was 2 streets away, and everything they'd been carrying was now in Alderman's hands, and there was a specific kind of quiet that comes after you have done the thing you set out to do, and can acknowledge for the first time that you were not entirely certain you could. Finally, Ethan set down his coffee cup and said, "Your father's ranch." She looked up. When this is settled, when Hendricks's leverage is gone, what do you want to happen with it? She had been thinking about this in the fragments of space between everything else. I want my father to keep it, she said. It was my mother's land before it was his. She's the one who built it into something worth keeping. She paused. I want him to have the chance to actually run it well without someone's thumb on the scale. And you? She looked at him. What about me? Where do you want to be when this is over? The question sat between them on the plain table in the plain room, and Liz was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had been not answering it for several days. It had been easy not to answer it when there was a case to build and a fire to document and a judge to prepare for. Without those things pressing, it was considerably less easy. I don't know yet, she said, which was true. I know where I don't want to be. Where's that? Anywhere I end up by default, she said. I want to choose. He nodded slowly, looking at the table. She watched him take that in and do whatever it was he did with information, that internal processing that was quiet and complete, and that she had never once seen him do out loud. That seems right, he said finally. She looked at him. When we get back to the ranch, she said carefully, I want you to finish the sentence you started 2 nights ago. He looked up. 7 years ago, she said, you stopped yourself. He was quiet for a moment. I know I did, he said. Why? Because the timing wasn't right, he said. We had a fire and a case file and billings in the morning. The timing is better now. He looked at her steadily. Not entirely, he said. But I'm done avoiding it. She waited. He didn't look away. 7 years ago, I was 20 years old, and I was coming back from the Helena supply run my father sent me on every spring. The road through the valley, you'd know the stretch south of the creek crossing where the dust gets heavy in June. She did know it. She had walked it 100 times. I came around the bend, he said, and there was a girl in a brown wool coat crouched down in the middle of the road. Liz went very still. She had found a dog, he said. Looked like it had been clipped by a wagon wheel. Hind leg was a mess. She was talking to it the way you talk to something frightened, low and steady, trying to keep it calm. 3 wagons had already gone around her. People were looking at her like she was in the way. He paused. I stopped. Liz did not move. She was not certain she was breathing. She didn't notice me for a good 2 minutes because she was entirely focused on the dog, he said. When she finally looked up, she didn't look embarrassed or apologetic the way most people would have. She just looked at me very directly and said, "Do you have any water?" Like it was the most ordinary request in the world. Like she had every right to be kneeling in the road for a hurt dog, and the rest of the world was simply in the wrong for going around her. The coffee in Liz's cup had gone cold. She hadn't touched it since he started talking. "I gave her the water," he said. "We got the dog to the side of the road. She wrapped his leg in a strip from her own coat, just tore it off, didn't hesitate. She said she'd take him to the family whose fence line it was, that she knew them, and they'd let her keep the dog until he healed." He stopped. "I asked her name." "Elizabeth Carter," Liz said. Her voice came out a little uneven. "Elizabeth Carter," he said. "She thanked me and picked up that dog, hurt leg and all, and walked off down the road like she had fully decided what mattered, and the rest of it wasn't worth her time." He looked at his own hands on the table. "I thought about her the whole ride home, and then I kept thinking about her." Liz stared at him. I came back through the valley twice more that year," he said. "I didn't go looking, that's not what it was, but I paid attention in a way I hadn't before. I heard about the Carter family and the way you hear about people in a small county and passing through other people's mouths. I heard your mother died when you were 18. I heard you were running the ranch." He paused. "I heard things got harder." "They did," she said quietly. "I thought about you," he said simply. "Not in a way I could explain or justify at the time. Just I thought about you, about whether you were all right, about that girl who tore up her own coat for a dog she'd never seen before." Liz sat with everything that had just been said and felt the full complicated weight of it. "You didn't know me," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was her trying to understand. "No," he said, "but I knew something about you. And sometimes that's different from knowing someone." She was quiet for a moment. "When my father's arrangement with Hendricks came to you." "It didn't come to me," he said. "I went looking for it." She blinked. "What?" "I heard through county talk that Hendricks was moving on the Carter debt," he said. "I heard that the arrangement being discussed involved the daughter. I went to find out who was in the middle of it and what could be done about it." "You engineered the arrangement," she said slowly. "I made an offer," he said. "Hendricks would rather have had cash and the Carter problem gone. I gave him an alternative that took the pressure off him while keeping you out of whatever he'd originally planned." He held her gaze. "I want you to understand something. I didn't do it because I thought I was saving you. I did it because the alternative was worse, and I had the means to make it better. Whether you wanted anything to do with me after that was entirely yours." Liz sat across from him in a restaurant in Billings on a Wednesday afternoon with cold coffee and the remnants of a meal she couldn't remember finishing, and felt the full shift of everything she thought she understood about how she had come to be sitting in this chair, in this city, on this day. "You gave me a room with a key," she said. "I gave you a room with a key," he confirmed. "You told me I could leave after 30 days. "Yes." "You meant it. Every word," he said quietly. "I didn't want you there under obligation. I wanted you there because you chose to be. And if that never happened, if you'd left after 30 days and gone somewhere else and built a life that had nothing to do with me, I would have made sure the debt situation was resolved some other way and been satisfied that you were all right." She looked at him for a long time. "That," she said, "is possibly the most stubborn and elaborate way of caring about someone that I have ever heard of." Something happened to his expression that she had never seen there before. It was brief and unguarded, and it made him look younger. "Probably," he agreed. 7 years, she said. 7 years. She shook her head slowly. Not in dismissal. In the specific kind of wonder that comes when something that seemed like accident reveals itself as intention. "I don't know what to do with that information," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," he said. I told you because you asked and because it was time, not because I need an answer to anything." She looked at him. "You are genuinely the most patient person I've ever encountered." "That's one word for it," he said. She almost laughed. Almost. The impulse surprised her enough that she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. "Let's go home," she said, and did not examine too carefully the way the word home had arrived so easily in that sentence, comfortable and unannounced. They were one day's ride from the ranch when the second message from her father caught up with them. A rider came up fast from the west on the road, and Liz knew before the man had pulled up alongside them that it was going to be something that mattered, because nobody rode like that for ordinary news. "Miss Carter." The rider was breathing harder than his horse. "Your father sent me. He said to find you and tell you." He stopped to catch his breath. "Hendricks filed something. Not in Helena. In Milford Creek. Filed a complaint with the county authority. Against your father directly. Says there are irregularities in the Carter land deed. Original filing from 1859. Liz felt ice in her stomach. "The original deed," she said. "He's attacking the original deed. He's claiming," the writer said, "that the survey notation in the original Carter filing was improperly recorded, and that the eastern boundary has been disputed since acquisition." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a copy. Your father had his lawyer copy it." Liz took it. She read it on horseback in 30 seconds because she had been reading documents like this for 3 weeks, and she could go straight to the language that mattered. Hendricks wasn't attacking the water rights. He wasn't attacking the Walker Ranch. He was attacking the Carter deed itself, claiming the eastern parcel, which included the best grazing land on the Carter property, had been improperly included in the original 1859 survey. If the complaint succeeded, her father would lose a third of his viable ranch land. And if her father lost that land, the remaining property couldn't support the ranch operations. It would collapse within a season. Hendricks wasn't trying to stop the investigation anymore. He already knew or suspected that the investigation was in motion. This was punishment. This was him making sure that even if he lost the larger fight, the people who had brought it to Alderman's door would pay personally for it. She handed the document to Ethan without speaking. He read it. His jaw set. "He's going around the hold," Ethan said. "Alderman's order covers the land authority filings on the Creek Corridor properties. This is a deed dispute. Different mechanism, different office." "Can Alderman extend the hold?" she said. "He can try. It takes time to file the extension." "How much time?" "Days. Maybe a week. Does my father have days?" She was already turning the problem over. "The complaint is filed. The county authority will have to acknowledge it and begin the formal review process. That's not immediate. They have to allow response time." 2 weeks minimum, Ethan said. "Standard county procedure. Then we have 2 weeks to respond." She looked at him. "I need to get to my father." There was a beat of silence. "I know," he said. "I need to see the original deed," she said. "If there's a flaw in the 1859 survey notation, I need to find it before Hendricks' lawyers do, and I need to know if it's real or manufactured. Manufactured, I can fight. Real." She stopped. "Real is harder, but not impossible. Boundary surveys can be refiled if the original notation can be shown to be a clerical error rather than an intentional misrepresentation." "Your father is going to be scared," Ethan said quietly. "I know," she said again. "He may not be easy to deal with." She looked at him. "He's never been easy to deal with," she said. "That hasn't changed what he is to me." She thought about the letter he'd sent, the relief on his face the morning he'd told her about the arrangement. The way he had never once in 22 years made her feel as seen as a stranger on a mountain road had made her feel in the first 10 minutes. She still loved him. That was the complicated, tiresome, entirely true thing about it. "I'll need to borrow a copy of Alderman's hold order," she said, "to show the county authority when I file the response to the deed complaint. It establishes the context of what Hendricks is doing." "I have the copy Alderman's clerk gave us before we left," Ethan said. "It's in my saddlebag." "Then let's not waste any more road." They changed direction and rode for Milford Creek. Her father was waiting at the gate when they arrived. He looked older than she remembered, which couldn't be right because it had only been 5 weeks, but grief and fear did things to people's faces, and her father was a man who was carrying both. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who did not know whether he had the right to be relieved. He looked at Ethan with something more complicated. She didn't have to come, her father said. Not to Liz, to Ethan. She chose to, Ethan said with the same level precision he applied to everything. That's a distinction worth keeping in mind, Mr. Carter. Her father flinched, small, almost invisible, but Liz saw it. She got down from her horse and walked to him and said, I need the original land deed, the 1859 filing. Where do you keep it? In the strong box, he said. Liz, we can talk after, she said. Right now I need the deed. He took her inside. He opened the strong box in his study, the same study where she had spent years going over the ranch accounts. The room that still smelled like the tobacco he had given up 3 years ago, and the particular dusty paper smell of documents kept longer than anyone had expected to need them. The deed was at the bottom of the box, folded in oilskin exactly where he had always kept it. She took it to the desk and opened it carefully the way she always handled things that mattered, taking care with the corners. She read it in full. Then she read the survey notation section twice more. Her father stood in the doorway. He knew better at this moment than to ask. She found it on the third read. It was not a flaw. It was not a manufactured error in the way she had feared. It was something slightly different and considerably more interesting. The 1859 survey notation referenced a boundary marker described as the southeast corner stake at the old Miller fence post. The old Miller property had been surveyed and refiled in 1871, 12 years after the Carter deed. In the 1871 Miller survey, the fence post location was described using a different reference point than the 1859 notation. Different enough that someone looking at the two documents without the original survey field notes would see what appeared to be a discrepancy. But it wasn't a discrepancy. It was a notation change. Both surveys described the same physical location using different reference language. If you had the original field notes, the actual survey records that predated both documents, the boundary was unambiguous. Who did the original 1859 survey? She asked her father. He blinked. Matthias Ford. He's been dead for 20 years. His records, she said. Field survey notebooks. Does the County Historical Records Office have them? I don't know. Maybe. Gerald Pratt, she said almost to herself. Gerald Pratt, who loved order above all things, and found most people's relationship with paperwork personally offensive, and had been running the county record office long enough to have seen and almost certainly kept everything. I need to go back to town, she said. Her father took a step forward. Liz, I owe you. Papa. She said it quietly, which stopped him more effectively than anything louder would have. You owe me a conversation, a real one, but not right now. She folded the deed carefully and returned it to the oilskin. Right now, I need you to trust me to handle this. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, which she hadn't expected, and which landed somewhere in the center of her chest with considerable weight. I've always trusted you to handle things, he said. That was my mistake. I should have handled them myself. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said simply and without cruelty. You should have. She picked up the deed. But we can't go back, so let's go forward. She went to find Ethan. Gerald Pratt did have Matthias Ford's survey notebooks. He had, in fact, all of Ford's survey notebooks from 1847 through 1863 organized chronologically in the climate-stable back room of the county record office that Pratt treated with the devotion most people reserved for places of worship. He produced the 1859 volume with the expression of a man who had always suspected these notebooks would matter eventually, and was vindicated to have been right. Liz found the Carter survey field entry in 12 minutes. The boundary notation was unambiguous. The southeast corner stake at the old Miller fence post was described with measurements from a fixed creek marker that had not changed in 70 years and did not depend on the Miller property resurvey of 1871 for its validity. The Carter eastern boundary was exactly where the deed said it was. She copied the relevant section verbatim had Pratt witness the copy and asked him directly whether he would be willing to provide this document to a legal proceeding if required. Gerald Pratt looked at her with those sharp eyes over his glasses. "Miss Carter," he said, "I have been the custodian of this county's records for 19 years. I have never once allowed an inaccuracy to stand in these files when I had the means to correct the record." He took the notebook back and returned it to its place with the care of a man returning something sacred. "Tell whoever needs to know that the original field notes are here and that they are intact and that they say what they say." "Thank you, Mr. Pratt," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm doing my job." She left the record office and stood on the Milford Creek boardwalk in the late afternoon with a notarized copy of the 1859 survey field entry in her hand and the full case arrayed in her mind like a finished ledger, every column balanced, every figure verified, every gap accounted for. Ethan was waiting at the horses. She held up the document. He read her expression before he read the paper. "You found it." "The boundary is clean," she said. "Matthias Ford's original field notes confirm it. Hendrick's lawyers found a notation inconsistency between the 1859 deed and the 1871 Miller resurvey, and they built a complaint around it, knowing that most people wouldn't know to look for the original field notes." She paused. "And they almost got away with it." "Almost," Ethan said. "This goes to Alderman with the rest of it," she said. The deed complaint, the original field notes, Pratt's statement. It shows that the Milford Creek filing was the same manufactured interference as everything else, just aimed at my family personally, because we're the ones who brought the case. Ethan looked at her steadily. "You understand what this means?" "It means Hendricks panicked," she said. "He filed something personal and sloppy and provable in a county where the records have been kept by a man who never throws anything away." She let out a long, slow breath. "He didn't expect anyone to know about Ford's notebooks." "He didn't expect you," Ethan said. She looked at him. "He built the whole thing," Ethan said quietly, "on the assumption that no one would be patient enough or careful enough or stubborn enough to go all the way back to 1859 to find the answer." He paused. "He didn't account for you." She stood on the Milford Creek boardwalk with the survey copy in her hand, and the mountain country cold coming down with the late afternoon. And she felt for the first time in 5 weeks something that was not urgency or determination or controlled anger. She felt like she had won something. Not the whole fight that was still ahead of them in Alderman's office and the Attorney General's files and whatever came next when a man like Hendricks finally understood that it was over. But something real. Something she had built with her own hands from nothing but 3 weeks of careful looking and the stubbornness that had always been the thing her father both relied on and failed to appreciate. "He didn't account for me," she agreed. She put the document in the case file. She looked up at Ethan. "Now we finish it," she said. The supplemental filing reached Judge Alderman's office in Billings by Friday morning, carried by the fastest rider Ethan had on the property, with Liz's full addendum attached the Matthias Ford field notes. Gerald Pratt's signed statement. The analysis of the notation inconsistency between the 1859 deed and the 1871 Miller resurvey, and a 2-page summary connecting the Milford Creek deed complaint to the pattern of manufactured interference already documented in the original case file. She had written the addendum the night before at her father's kitchen table, while her father sat across from her and said nothing, because he had finally, after 22 years of filling silence with words that weren't the right ones, understood that the most useful thing he could do was be quiet and let her work. Margaret had made coffee. She had set it down without ceremony and gone to bed, which was, Liz had come to understand over the past 5 weeks, the most honest expression of respect the woman was capable of. Her father watched her write for 2 hours. When she closed the notebook and started organizing the pages, he said, "Your mother would have done exactly this." She looked up. She had that same way of going still when something mattered, he said. Everything else would go quiet in her, and she'd just work the problem. Straight through, no stopping. He looked at his hands. I used to watch her the way I've been watching you tonight. Liz was quiet for a moment. You never told me that, she said. I didn't tell you a lot of things I should have, he said. I let you carry things that were mine to carry because you were willing, and I was tired, and I told myself it was because you were capable. He stopped. But capable and willing don't mean the same thing as it being right to ask. She looked at him across the table. His face in the lamplight was older than it had been in the morning, and she understood that the aging she had noticed when she first arrived wasn't grief or fear exactly. It was the specific weight of a man who had been looking clearly at himself for the first time in a long while and not finding the view comfortable. I'm not going to tell you it was fine, she said, because it wasn't. She paused. But I'm also not going to tell you that it broke me, because it didn't. He nodded very slowly. You were always stronger than I deserved, he said. I wasn't strong for you, she said. I was strong because I didn't know how to be anything else. There's a difference. She picked up the completed addendum and squared the pages against the table. The ranch is going to be all right. When this is finished, Hendricks won't be able to touch it. You need to actually run it this time. Hire the right people. Keep the accounts clean. I'll show you what to look for. You'd do that, he said. After everything. She looked at him steadily. You're my father, she said as if it were the simplest fact in the world, which it was. That doesn't change because you made mistakes. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the table. She could see him fighting something that he probably would not let himself express out loud, because he was fundamentally a man who didn't know how to be undone in front of other people, and she had over 22 years learned not to push him past the point where he could manage. Get some sleep, Papa, she said. I'll be back in the morning. She went out to find Ethan, who was at the corral, talking to the Carter ranch hand, who had stayed on through the hard months because he was apparently the kind of man who didn't abandon a struggling operation even when he had better options. She liked that about him. She made a mental note to tell her father to pay him properly. Ethan looked up when she came out. It's done, she said, holding up the addendum. Write her in the morning. He nodded. How are you? She considered the question honestly, which she had been doing more often lately. Considering things honestly, rather than deflecting toward what was practical or necessary. Tired, she said. And something else I don't have a clean word for yet. Something good or something bad? She thought about it. Something true, she said finally. I think it might be something true. He looked at her in the way he had, steady and unhurried, that she had spent 5 weeks learning to read and still found herself surprised by. Go sleep, he said. The rider goes at dawn. You can breathe after that. She went inside and slept better than she had in a months. Alderman's formal response came 8 days later. 8 days in which Liz reorganized her father's accounts, identified 3 areas of spending that could be tightened without affecting operations, and wrote a 2-page summary for her father explaining what to watch for in his supplier arrangements going forward. She also wrote out twice more with Ethan to speak with families on the creek corridor who hadn't been part of the original filing the Hallorans in full this time, and a family named Prescott, who had been among the first approached about their water access, and who, had it turned out, kept meticulous notes of every conversation with every outside party since the trouble began, because Mrs. Prescott was a woman who had always believed that the day would come when those notes would matter. The day had come. When Alderman's letter arrived, it came with 2 additional documents, attached a formal notice of territorial investigation into the Land Authority, filing practices affecting the Northern Creek Corridor properties, signed by the Territorial Attorney General's office in Helena, and a separate criminal referral notice for the arson incident directed to both the county sheriff and the territorial marshal's office. Liz read all 3 documents at Ethan's kitchen table, with May standing at the stove doing a very poor job of pretending not to be listening. The investigation was formal. It was official. It named Victor Hendricks by name as the subject of inquiry. She set the documents down. May turned from the stove. "Well," she said. "It's official," Liz said. May nodded once with the satisfaction of a woman whose opinion of the outcome had never been in serious doubt. "Biscuits," she said and turned back to the stove. Ethan read the letters in order carefully the way he read everything. When he finished, he set them down aligned with the edge of the table, which was a small thing, but which she had learned meant he was satisfied. "The Attorney General," he said. "That's what you wanted." "That's what the evidence warranted," she said. "I just made sure the evidence was visible." He looked at her. "Don't do that." She blinked. "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller than what you did," he said. "You built the case. You organized 17 families' worth of documentation into something a judge could act on. You found Ford's notebooks. You did the work. Take credit for the work." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said and meant it. "I did the work." "You did the work," he confirmed, and there was something in the way he said it. Simple, complete, requiring no further elaboration, that settled into her chest and stayed there. Barbara. Victor Hendricks did not go quietly, because men like Victor Hendricks never did. His lawyers filed 3 separate motions challenging the scope of Alderman's hold order in the first week after the investigation was announced. They argued procedural deficiencies in the filing, challenged the standing of several of the families in the documented case, and attempted to have the arson referral separated from the land fraud investigation, on the grounds that they were unrelated matters. Liz tracked every motion through the county record office, where Gerald Pratt provided her with copies, with the resigned efficiency of a man who had made peace with the fact that his office had become a kind of field station for the ongoing legal conflict. Each motion failed. The procedural challenge was dismissed in 4 days. The standing argument collapsed when Alderman's office produced a formal summary of the investigation scope that specifically included all 17 families. The arson separation request was denied on the grounds that the Territorial Marshal's office had already established a connection between the Riders and a property associated with Hendricks' operation, a connection that Casper's prior incident dates had helped establish. Because the dates corresponded to movement records at a Hendricks-owned staging property 20 miles south. That last denial was the one that mattered most, because it meant the arson investigation and the land fraud investigation were moving together and combined. They created a picture of a man who had been operating without accountability for long enough that he had stopped believing accountability was possible. He had been wrong. Liz was in Milford Creek when she heard about the arson connection from the county sheriff's deputy, who stopped her on the street to tell her that the investigation had produced a result she might want to know about. She thanked him and walked to the end of the block and stood there for a moment by herself, and she thought about the 4 riders coming up the south road in the dark, and the smell of smoke, and Ethan handing her a bucket, without asking whether she was going to help, just assuming she would, because he already knew her well enough to know the answer. She thought about how different that was from every other assumption anyone had made about her. Then she went to the telegraph office and sent a message to Ethan at the ranch. "Arson connected officially. Tell Casper he did his job well. Back tomorrow." The reply came within the hour, which meant Ethan had been near the telegraph office, or someone had ridden fast to reach him. "Casper says it was your dates that made it. Come home safe. Come home safe." She read it twice. She sent back, "I will." That's a hug. The formal hearing before Judge Alderman was set for the 3rd week of October, and it was not a trial that would come later in a different proceeding with Hendricks's lawyers and the Attorney General's office facing each other across a courtroom in ways that would take months to fully resolve. But the October hearing was the one that mattered for the families on the Creek Corridor, because it was where Alderman would rule on the permanent status of the Land Authority protections, and where the deed complaint against the Carter property would be formally dismissed. Liz prepared for it the way she had prepared for everything over the past 2 months. Methodically, completely, without leaving gaps she hadn't accounted for. She also, in the 2 weeks before the hearing, had the conversation with her father that she had been putting off since the night she wrote the addendum at his kitchen table. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was quiet and her father was mending a section of fence at the north edge of the property, doing the physical work himself, the way he sometimes did when he needed to think. She rode out and tied her horse at the fence post and helped him without asking permission, handing him the wire when he needed it and holding the post steady while he worked. They worked in silence for a while. Then her father said, "You're going back to the Walker Ranch." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Is it work?" he said. "Or is it something else?" She considered how to answer that and then decided that the answer he deserved was the honest one because she was done managing her father's feelings at the expense of her own truth. "Both," she said. "The work is real and I'm good at it and I want to continue it." She paused. "And it's something else." Her father was quiet for a moment, working the wire. "Ethan Walker is a good man," he said. "I didn't know that when I signed those papers. I want you to know, I know it now." "It wouldn't have changed what you did," she said, not unkindly. "No," he said. "Probably not. That's what I'm ashamed of." She looked at the fence line running out across the Carter land, the land her mother had chosen, the land she had grown up, on the land that was now protected because she had refused to let a tired and frightened man's mistakes be the final word. "Don't be ashamed," she said. "Just do better. That's all I want from you. Do better than you did going forward." He set down the wire tool and looked at her with the expression of a man who had come to the end of something and didn't entirely know what came next. "You know," he said quietly. "When you were small, your mother used to say that you'd gotten her stubbornness and her kindness both, and that was going to make your life either very powerful or very hard, depending on what you chose to do with it." Liz was quiet. "Looks like she was right on both counts," he said. She picked up the wire tool and handed it back to him. "Finish the fence, Papa," she said, and she could hear in her own voice something that might to someone listening carefully have sounded like forgiveness beginning its long, slow work. The October hearing lasted 3 hours. Liz sat at the front of the public gallery with the Hallorans on one side of her and Margaret Dunn on the other, and Tom Brewster and his wife behind, and the Prescotts beside them, and 6 other families from the creek corridor filling the rows behind. And she felt the weight of all of them in the room as something real and solid and entirely different from burden. This was what it felt like to be the person who had put something together that mattered to people who needed it to matter. She had built this case in 3 weeks on a mountain she had never visited with a man she had never met, starting from a position of having no choices, and arriving here with more of them than she had ever had in her life. She watched aldermen work through the documents with the precise, methodical attention she had expected, and she listened to the Hendricks lawyers argue their last remaining motions with the diminishing energy of men who knew the ground was gone beneath their feet, and she held herself very still and very present for all of it. When aldermen ruled the land, authority protections made permanent pending the conclusion of the criminal investigation. The deed complaint against the Carter property dismissed with a formal notation that the complaint had been filed without evidentiary foundation, and in apparent bad faith, the water rights on the Northern Creek corridor confirmed under existing ownership. She heard Margaret Dunn let out a breath beside her that sounded like something that had been held for a very long time. She reached over and covered Margaret Dunn's hand with hers without thinking about it. Margaret Dunn turned her hand over and held on. She. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, the families gathered in the particular loose way of people who don't have formal protocol for this kind of moment and are making it up in real time. There was handshaking and some crying, and a lot of the kind of quiet, overwhelmed conversation that happens when relief is too large to manage all at once. Tom Brewster shook Liz's hand for a long time and didn't say much, which she had come to understand was his version of saying a great deal. Mrs. Prescott told her that she had kept notes for 3 years, believing something would eventually come of it, and she was glad it had come of something this particular, which was the most direct and moving compliment Liz could remember receiving. Old Gerald Pratt had come up from Milford Creek for the hearing, which she suspected he had done for the records rather than for the people, but which mattered either way. He nodded at her on the steps with the dignity of a man whose files had proved their worth, and she nodded back, and that was sufficient. Ethan was at the edge of the courthouse steps where he had positioned himself at the start of the morning. Not at the front, not demanding any portion of the attention. Just present in the way he was always present, steady and certain and entirely himself. She worked her way through the gathered families until she reached him. He looked at her. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She looked out at the families on the courthouse steps at Margaret Dunn, still talking to the Hallorans, at Tom Brewster's wife, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, at the Prescott children who hadn't entirely understood what the morning was about, but who were old enough to read their parents' faces and know that something had gone right. 17 families, she said quietly. "And whatever comes after the criminal investigation," Ethan said. "There are probably more." "I know." She had already been thinking about it. The Attorney General's office had opened a broader inquiry into land authority practices across the territory based on what the alderman hearing had produced. There were other counties. There were other creek systems. There were other families who had been sitting with manufactured problems and no map of who was doing it to them. "I've been asked to consult on the broader inquiry." Ethan went still. "When?" "This morning before the hearing. One of the Attorney General's representatives." She had said she would think about it, which was true. She had been thinking about very little else since. It would mean travel. It would mean going through records in counties I don't know with families I haven't met. How long? A year, possibly. Possibly longer, depending on what the inquiry finds. He was quiet for a moment. "Liz," he said. "I haven't given them an answer yet," she said. "You should say yes." She looked at him. "You didn't let me finish." He waited. "I said I would think about it," she said. "And what I've been thinking is that I want to say yes. And I want to know." She stopped. This was the sentence she had been composing since the representative had found her in the courthouse hall that morning. "I want to know what that means for where I am and where I'm going. Whether the ranch is still—" She stopped again. "Home," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Whether the ranch is still home." Ethan Walker stood on the courthouse steps in October with the morning sun coming over the buildings and the gathered families behind them, and looked at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who had been patient for 7 years and had no intention of being anything other than completely honest now. "The ranch is yours as long as you want it to be," he said. "Come back between counties, come back between cases, come back when you need to and leave when you need to, and know that the room with the key is yours, and May will have kept the biscuit recipe exactly the same, and I will be—" He stopped. "I will be there." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know," she said, "most people would have led with the feelings and gotten to the practical arrangements eventually. I'm not most people," he said. "No," she said. "You really aren't." She stepped closer to him, not dramatically, just close enough that the conversation became the kind that happens between two people who have decided that the distance between them has served its purpose and can now be set aside. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he said. "That girl in the brown coat didn't know you were there," she said. "I know," he said. "She was busy." Something opened up in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. "She was busy," she agreed, and her voice came out slightly less steady than she had intended, and she found she didn't particularly mind. "Liz." He said her name the way he always said it, without ornamentation, like it was sufficient by itself, which was how she knew he meant it. "I'm not asking you for anything you haven't already decided to give freely. I want you to know that." "I know," she said. "I've known that since the first morning when you told me I could leave after 30 days. She looked at him steadily. "I also want you to know that I'm not staying because I'm grateful, and I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm staying when I stay because I choose to. Every time." "That's all I've ever wanted," he said. "I know that too," she said. She reached out and touched his hand where it rested at his side. Not dramatically, not as a grand gesture, just a deliberate chosen thing that said what it needed to say. And he turned his hand and held hers the way a man holds something he has been careful with for a long time and intends to go on being careful with. They stood like that on the courthouse steps in October, while the families of the Northern Creek corridor talked and cried and shook hands and began slowly the business of going home to their land and their water and their lives, which were safer now than they had been in 3 years. Because a woman had been sent away like a debt, and had decided somewhere on a cold mountain morning that she was not finished yet. That winter, the Walker Ranch was different, not in ways that could be easily described to someone who hadn't known it before. May still ran the kitchen with the same brisk, capable warmth. Holt still looked slightly panicked whenever anything unexpected happened. The mountain still came down at evening, in the particular way it did, heavy and certain and real. But the house had a quality that it hadn't had when Liz first arrived. Something she hadn't had language for in those first weeks and could name now more clearly. It was inhabited, fully deliberately inhabited by people who had chosen to be there. Liz worked the consulting role with the Attorney General's office through November and into December, traveling to 2 adjacent counties with a younger colleague from the Helena office who was smart and eager and who she took some satisfaction in teaching how to read the patterns in land authority records, what to look for, where the gaps were, how manufactured irregularities tended to reveal themselves to anyone who was patient enough to trace them back far enough. She came back to the ranch between trips the way Ethan had said she could. Every time she came back, May made biscuits. Not because it was a special occasion. Because it was Tuesday. Or because it was cold. Or because she felt like it. May's stated reasons for biscuits were never quite the same twice, but they always coincided with Liz's return with a precision that could not have been entirely accidental. Liz stopped commenting on it after the 3rd time, because May's expression when she thought she was being obvious was one of the finer things she had encountered, and she didn't want to deprive herself of it. Her father's ranch stabilized by spring. The accounts organized according to the system Liz had put in place over 3 visits home were the cleanest they had been in a decade. He had hired 2 reliable hands, and had through means she suspected involved Ethan making a quiet introduction, connected with a supplier arrangement that was straightforward and fairly priced. He was running the operation himself, the way he should have been doing for years. And while he would never be the kind of man who found it easy to say what he felt he had taken to leaving small practical things, a repaired fence tool, returned without being asked a cleared drainage problem. She mentioned in passing as a vocabulary of care that she was learning to receive. Margaret, to her moderate surprise, asked Liz one spring afternoon to look at the household accounts. She said she had always managed them, but wasn't sure she was doing it right, and would Liz mind. Liz sat with her for 2 hours and showed her what to look for, and Margaret listened with the focused attention of a woman who took very few things lightly, and at the end she said, "You're good at this." "I know," Liz said. Margaret looked at her with something that was not quite warmth, but was moving in that direction. "Your mother was good at things too," she said. "Different things, but that quality of being good at something, and knowing it, she had that." Liz thought about what her father had said the night she wrote the addendum. Your mother would have done exactly this. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than Margaret probably knew. Sir, Victor Hendricks was indicted in February on 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of interference with territorial land authority proceedings, and 1 count of conspiracy in the arson of the Walker outbuilding, based on the evidence the Territorial Marshal's Office had developed from Casper's dates and the staging property records. His lawyers filed motions. His lawyers' motions were denied. The process moved forward with the grinding, inevitable momentum of legal machinery that has been properly set in motion by evidence that cannot be refuted. He did not go to prison immediately. These things took their time, but he was finished. The thing he had built over 15 years of careful, patient, systematic manipulation of the county's land and water systems was dismantled publicly and on the record, and every family along the Northern Creek corridor knew that the name Victor Hendricks would never again have authority over anything that was theirs. Liz heard about the indictment from the county deputy who had told her about the arson connection, and she received the news standing at the Walker Ranch's south fence line, where she and Holt had been checking the new repair work, and she thanked the deputy and stood there for a moment after he left. Holt was watching her with the uncertain expression he wore when he didn't know what the appropriate response to a situation was. "Good news," he tried. "Yes," she said. "Real good or just good?" She looked at the fence line, straight and sound and properly built, running out across the mountain land in the cold spring air. "Real good," she said. "The kind that actually sticks." She went to tell Ethan. She found him at the corral, where he spent more time than anywhere else on the property, and she walked up and leaned on the fence rail beside him and said, "Hendricks was indicted this morning." He looked at her. 4 fraud counts, she said. 2 interference counts. 1 arson conspiracy count. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand over hers on the fence rail. "Your father's deed is clear," he said. "Permanently on the record," she said. "Gerald Pratt filed the confirmation himself. I think he enjoyed it." "He would," Ethan said. They stood at the fence rail in the spring morning, and the mountain sat behind the ranch the way it always did, large and old, and entirely unconcerned with human timelines, and the horses moved in the corral in the easy, unhurried way they had when nothing was required of them. "I've been offered a permanent position with the Attorney General's office," Liz said. "The lead investigator for land fraud cases in the territory." Ethan's hand was still on hers. He did not move it. "When did you hear?" he said. "Last week," she said. "I've been thinking about it." And she turned to look at him directly. "I'm going to take it," she said. "It's the right work for the right reasons, and there are families in 4 counties who are sitting with exactly what the Creek Corridor families were sitting with a year ago, and I know how to help them." She paused. "And I'm going to do it from here. I told them the position requires travel, not relocation. They agreed." He looked at her. "You negotiated the terms." "Of course I negotiated the terms," she said. Something moved in his expression, that brief, unguarded thing that made him look younger. "You told them you needed to stay in the Northern Ridge County." "I told them I had reasons to stay in the Northern Ridge County," she said, "and that if the position couldn't accommodate that, I would continue consulting on a case-by-case basis instead." "But they said yes." "They said yes," she said, "because they need someone who knows how to read the patterns, and they know they're not going to find another one of me easily." He looked at her for a long moment with the steady, complete attention that had been one of the first things she had understood about him, and that she had not once stopped being grateful for. "No," he said quietly. "They're not." She turned back to the corral. "I want to expand the accounting work here too," she said. "More formally. The Creek Corridor families need better financial documentation systems, so that when someone tries to plant a scheme like Greer's again, they'll catch it themselves before it gets as far as it got." She had been thinking about this for months. "I can set up templates, quarterly review schedules, teach the families themselves what to look for. Make it part of the ongoing work." "You're building something," he said. "I'm trying to," she said. "Something that doesn't require someone to stumble into it from the outside to catch the problem. Something that lives in the community itself." He nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. The question was so like him, not asking whether she needed anything, not waiting to be asked, just moving directly to the useful part. "A desk in the study," she said, "permanently." He almost smiled. "You've had a desk in the study for 6 months. I want it to be mine," she said. "Not borrowed, not temporary, mine." He looked at her with the full weight of everything that sentence contained, which was considerably more than the words themselves, and she let him look because she was done being careful with this part. "It's yours," he said. "And I want May to know I'm not a guest," she said. "May has known you weren't a guest since approximately your 4th day here," he said. "She'll be insufferable when I tell her she was right." "She's already insufferable," Liz said. "It's one of her best qualities." He laughed, quietly, the way he did everything but real and complete. She had heard him laugh before 4 or 5 times in 6 months, and every time it surprised her in the same way, the same small shock of warmth. She turned to face him fully, there at the corral fence with the spring morning around them, and the work she had built, and the life she was choosing, laid out in every direction she looked. "Ethan," she said. "Liz," he said. "7 years ago you saw something in a girl on a dusty road that nobody else bothered to stop for," she said. "And you kept it, and you waited, and when the moment came, you opened a door without demanding anything from what was on the other side." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I didn't fall in love with you because you waited," she said. "I fell in love with you because of who you are when you're not waiting. Because of how you handed me a bucket without asking me first. Because of how you knocked on the study door every single time. Because you told me to take credit for my own work." She paused. "Because you drew the map and knew every family on the creek and loved this county the way people love things they actually intend to stay for." He was looking at her with an expression she had no word for yet, but intended to spend a considerable amount of time learning. "I love you," she said. "Not because you reminded me I was worth saving, because you were worth staying for." He reached up and touched her face the way a man touches something he has been careful with for a long time, with the full knowledge of what it is and the full intention of what comes next. "I've loved you since the dusty road in June," he said, "and I intend to love you for every year past this one, and I'm not patient about that part anymore." She leaned into his hand. "Good," she said. "I was starting to think the patience was permanent." He kissed her there at the corral fence in the spring morning. The kind of kiss that belongs to people who have earned it not through suffering, but through the slow, deliberate daily choosing of each other over everything that tried to make them smaller. The months that followed were not easy, because good lives rarely are. There were cases that broke her heart before she could fix them. Families she reached too late, counties where the damage had been done so thoroughly that the best she could offer was documentation and the slow grind of legal remedy rather than anything that felt like rescue. There were nights she came back to the ranch tired in a way that went past her bones, and nights the mountain felt too large, and the work too endless, and the injustice too systematically deliberately cruel for her to find the clean anger that usually kept her moving. On those nights, May put something hot on the table without being asked, and Holt found something to fix loudly enough to be heard through the wall, and Ethan sat with her, and did not try to make it smaller than it was, because he understood that some things needed to be held in their full size before they could be managed. She learned to let him hold them with her. That was the work she did on herself in the spaces between all the other work, learning that needing someone was not the same as losing herself. That choosing to lean was not the same as falling. That love between people who had both learned to stand on their own was not a compromise of independence, but a doubling of it. Ethan learned too. He learned to say things before he had finished being certain of them, because she told him once that certainty at the expense of communication was its own kind of distance. He learned to let her see when he was tired or unsettled, because she had told him that his steadiness was not something she needed him to perform. He was not a finished man when she arrived, and she was not a finished woman, and the life they built together was built by two people who were still becoming. That was the truest thing about it. In the spring of the following year, on a Sunday morning, when the mountain was doing the particular thing it did in April, where the light came across the top of the ridge in a way that made everything look briefly possible, Ethan asked her to marry him at the kitchen table, while May was making coffee and Holt was doing something noisy with a fence post outside, and the whole ordinary machinery of the ranch was running around them exactly as it always had. He asked her quietly, directly, without ceremony, with the same steadiness he brought to everything that mattered. She said yes, the same way. May set down 2 cups of coffee on the table without comment and went back to the stove, and from outside came the sound of Holt dropping the fence post, and then picking it up again, and the mountain sat in the morning light above all of it, old and permanent, and entirely unconcerned, the way it would always be. Elizabeth Carter had been sent away like a payment. She had arrived on a mountain expecting nothing, carrying everything she had in one travel case with no map and no certainty, and no one who was required to care what happened to her. She had built something anyway, not because someone saved her, Not because love found her in the dark and let her out, but because she was a woman who knew how to read the truth in the numbers, who could find the pattern in 17 cases of manufactured cruelty and put it together into something a judge could act on, who had torn a strip from her own coat for a dog she had never met and handed a stranger her honesty before she handed him anything else. She had been worth saving all along. She had simply needed a road and a man who stopped on it, and enough time to remember who she was before the world decided what she was worth. She remembered now. She did not intend to forget again.